Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, we are going to talk about perhaps one of the most unusual topics you've written about, but maybe not. And it's the NRA and corporate governance. First of all, great blog post, which we're going to link to, but why should we study what has happened to the NRA?
So, what happened here, Tom? The news peg was that last week, a state judge in New York gave his final ruling on long litigation that the National Rifle Association had been in with the state attorney general of New York, Letitia James. She had filed a lawsuit against the NRA and its then senior executives in 2020, alleging rampant mismanagement at the NRA, where the former CEO, Wayne LaPierre, and a few of his other cronies, she alleged that they had years of favorable dealings and plundering the NRA resources, using it as their own personal piggy bank, all of which would violate state charity laws where New York, the NRA was chartered in the state of New York. So that litigation, the civil lawsuit came in 2020. 4 years of legal wrangling all over the place, into bankruptcy court, out of bankruptcy court, back and forth. Finally, there was a jury trial earlier this year where basically Letitia James prevailed, and the jury found that Wayne LaPierre and his cronies were liable for abuses and mismanagement at the NRA. Then this summer came a whole lot of machinations and negotiations between Letitia James and the NRA under the oversight of Supreme Court Judge Joel Cohen about what sort of corporate governance reforms the NRA should adopt to make sure this sort of thing does not happen again. And finally, we had a final ruling. The litigation's now over from Judge Cohen last week, listing numerous corporate governance reforms the NRA must make, some of which it had already started to make. But Tom, it is a fascinating lesson in good corporate governance. These measures that Judge Cohen has laid down and that the NRA is going to implement, or maybe already has begun to implement, they're great stuff. And every organization that wants to take good governance and transparency seriously, you should give this a read and understand not just what are the specific measures that Judge Cohen recommended or ordered the NRA to implement, but why those specific measures are so good and what are they driving at? And they're driving really at an empowered board and transparency through an empowered independent compliance function. That should be music to the ears of every compliance professional, regardless of what you think of the NRA and its public policy, gun rights, political positions, many of which will drive a lot of Americans right up the wall. Put all of that aside and focus on the substance of corporate governance reforms here. The NRA is going to have to do some very interesting, very compelling stuff that, frankly, any organization would do well to study it and try and copy those reforms and make sure the same principles are embedded in your own organization.
Matt, in your penultimate paragraph in your blog post, you say, quote, good governance is a universal principle dependent on building durable structures for transparency and vigorous oversight. I hope every listener that will be their takeaway from this. At least that was my takeaway from your blog post. But now could we go through some of the specifics of what the court has ordered, both around transparency and then around durability as well?
Sure. So I'll take it from 2 points. Basically, the fundamental flaws of the NRA, at least through the 2010s, which was the period in which Letitia James had been focused, and possibly even further back, was a structurally weak board. The board had 76 members, still does. That is unto itself not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of nonprofits do have very large boards, but that allowed for a small number of activist board directors to work quite closely with the then CEO, Wayne LaPierre. He had been in charge of the NRA for decades at this point, but basically he had this small little faction of the NRA that kind of rubber stamped what he wanted. And what he wanted throughout the 2010s was lavish salaries, all sorts of personal lavish lifestyle spending that he billed to the NRAs, custom made Italian suits that he would bill to the NRA, yacht trips, personal private jet flights, and whatnot, all of it billed to the NRA. A lot of conflicts of interest where contracts would go to certain preferred vendors for the NRA, and then that vendor would treat Wayne LaPierre and his wife and friends and family to a yacht trip in the Mediterranean or off the coast of Dubai, things like that. But these are things we have heard before. Overpowering, larger than life CEO, structurally weak board that couldn't exercise proper oversight over that CEO, and then weak financial controls that let the CEO withhold information from the full board so that he or she could continue to live his lifestyle. And like I said, Tom, you and I have talked about that kind of thing many times before on this podcast. Oddly enough, this first really sort of burst into the scene around 2019 when a new president at the NRA, which is functionally the equivalent of the chairman of the board, a new president of the board came into power. That was Oliver North. That Oliver North from the 1980s, former colonel of the army who was at the center of the Iran-Contra disgrace and scandal in the Reagan administration, then became a right-wing provocateur and talk show host for many years. So Oliver North winds up president of the board at the NRA. And he realized there's probably fraud going on at the NRA. He tried to get to the source of this, and he wanted to see documentation from the NRA. And the NRA employees would not do that at the instruction of Mr. LaPierre. Eventually, Oliver North got ousted as board chairman. So there's still cronyism, there's still entrenchment. At this point, Letitia James came into the fray with her civil lawsuit. Oliver North wound up testifying on behalf of the state of New York against Mr. LaPierre and the NRA. Kind of weird political bedfellows there, but so long as it gets an organization back on the right path, I'll take it, whatever. But that was all of the misconduct that was here. Weak financial controls, weak board, structurally weak, and also just kind of feckless oversight from the directors at the time. And then a larger than life CEO who withheld all the information and treated the organization and its resources like his personal plate. All right. So what actually did the judge say that the NRA must do? A couple of things. For example, reforms to the board's audit committee. Audit committee members now are elected by the full board. They were not necessarily elected by the full board before. They were selected by a certain small number of board directors acting in coordination with Mr. LaPierre. Great way to get all of his cronies and friends to be the ones on the audit committee, which is exactly the wrong sort of a thing you want. More independent audit committee. Also, the judge barred anybody who served on the audit committee from 2014 through 2022. They can never serve on the audit committee ever again. There must be a new director nominations policy at the NRA, where the nominating and governance committee of the board must now, for at least the next 5 years, submit 20 names, not 20% of the full board, which would be like 14 or 15 people out of 76. No, they have to come up with 20 director candidates every year for the next 5 years to get fresh blood into the board. It's still going to be a large board of 76. So reform number 3 is there is going to be a committee of organization, which will come up with ways to make this board more effective and properly wieldy, because it is decidedly unwieldy right now. A lot of nonprofits at universities, hospitals, or whatnot, you see this, that you've got like 55 members of the board, but really there's an executive committee of 9 or 11, and they really call the shots. I would be surprised if we don't see, I think we'll see some sort of recommendation like that for a smaller executive committee. We'd need to think about what are the protections to make sure that executive committee will not become another extension of a overweening CEO in the future. We'll have to see about that. We don't know. And then, Tom, there's a couple of other things here that are more on the organizational side. There's going to be an annual compliance report for at least the next 5 years, which goes to the full board. It will be compiled by the chief compliance officer. The NRA created that position and filled it at the end of 2023, I believe, by a very competent former corporate lawyer. But anyways, that compliance report will need to document all of the first class travel expenses, all of the related party transactions, all of the exceptions to the NRA travel policy that are granted to NRA executives, and ranking who are the NRA employees who get the most exceptions to the travel policy, because luxury travel, luxury spending, related party transactions, these are all the things that got the NRA into trouble with Letitia James. And in fairness, were all the things that got Oliver North first curious about, is there corruption going on? And he was correct. There was. So there's that annual compliance report. And then there will also be an outside consultant who must be hired to work with the chief compliance officer, thinking about more good governance policies the NRA and the board should adopt. And then finally, Tom, last thing, listeners, I promise, but this is the coolest. I saved the best for last. There are going to be employment protections for the chief compliance officer. It is a man at the moment, but he or she in the future, he must have a 3-year contract, which guarantees 2 full years of severance pay if the chief compliance officer is ever terminated without cause. So there's a whole lot of stuff there. We can unpack it all, but it gets to the heart of the problem, which, like I said, was poor board oversight, letting a oversized, overpowering CEO run rampant thanks to poor financial controls, and treating the organization like his personal plaything. That's how we're going to try and fix it.
Matt, you attached or linked to rather the court's ruling, and they actually attach several exemplars of
Oh,
what
yes.
you've discussed. Could you go through those and talk about how those might guide a chief compliance officer or the new board?
Yeah, this is the coolest thing here for compliance officers who have listened so far and are thinking, great, these reforms sound like nifty ideas. There are also in the settlement that you can find, it's on my blog post. I'm sure you can dig it up through the New York court system as well. There are exhibits attached to the ruling that are sample agreements. So, a sample employment agreement for the CEO, a sample director nomination policy, a sample copy of the compliance report. And the compliance report must also list things like all calls that came into the whistleblower hotline, not every individual call, but just a summation of, here are the calls we had, here's how they were rectified or addressed, things like that. So if you are wondering what sort of compliance report you'd like to give to your board, you could use that template as inspiration for your own. Now, do you have to follow it to the letter? No. If your organization had been suffering from rampant abuse of CEO perks and lavish spending, maybe you'd want to copy it pretty much word for word, because that was the NRA's problem. But if you had other issues, you could at least start to think about, okay, how would I take this issue of my organization and the compliance data that the board would find useful to address that problem? How would I take that idea and put it into this sort of a template? Ditto for the employment contract, ditto for some of the other things that the NRA must adopt. I think there were a total of 3 or 4 different exhibits there that you could use to help with your corporate governance. You could use for a stronger, more empowered compliance function, and give a sense of, here are the things that I should be bringing to the board's attention. You don't have to copy it word for word, but if you're just looking for the raw material, it's good stuff and it's freely available now.
Why is these issues around good corporate governance so universal in your opinion?
That's the thing that stuck with me, is that I'll say in full disclosure, I don't actually agree with many of what the NRA does in its activities, with most of that activity. I appreciate the NRA's efforts at gun safety education. That's a good thing. But I personally, as an American, I disagree with a lot of their views on free gun rights. I think that gun usage should be curtailed more than it currently is. I'm sure a lot of Americans agree with me. And then at the end, I said, who cares? That has nothing to do with the principles of good governance here. And that is something that struck me, is that really good governing principles for an organization are universal and separate from the exact business objectives or ethical or business priorities that the organization has. I'm sure that there are probably many liberal organizations out there that would drive the NRA's fans and supporters absolutely crazy. But again, who cares whether you are a liberal advocacy group, a conservative advocacy group, whether you are a for profit business or a nonprofit business? Really, the things that make you succeed to achieve your objectives, regardless of what those objectives are, is a strong board, a structurally strong board that cannot be cowed and bent to the wills of a single executive, which has happened here, it's happened elsewhere. Tom, off the top of my head, I could think that's really what happened with Theranos and its fraudulent blood testing with Elizabeth Holmes. That's what happened with Wynn Resorts and Steve Wynn, who turned out had been a sexual harasser for years. We could go on and on. An overpowering CEO can bend the board to his will if the board isn't structurally strong. And you're not structurally strong if you don't have the right governance structures, like right in place, right in the charter, right in all of the governance documents. And that is what this judge is trying to drive at, is trying to build stronger structures for a stronger board that can be a good counterweight to the CEO. Now that's one. But the other universal principle is that the board needs to be able to see what's really going on at the organization that might cause us ethics and compliance trouble. That will differ from one organization to another, but you need to be able to see the data. Again, there is now going to be a structural mechanism for the board to do that. It is that annual compliance report that spells out exactly what the CCO must report, and it's all stuff that is highly relevant to this issue and this lawsuit that just got settled. But again, that's nice to write down in paper. If the CCO can't actually do it because he or she is afraid of being fired or they're getting pressure from the CEO, what's good is it to say that we have this nice flowery looking statement on a piece of paper? You need actual substantive empowerment of the CCO. And we have that here too. Again, at other organizations, doesn't necessarily need to be the chief compliance officer. All of the internal audit executives who are listening, you guys could benefit from this too. But it is more about how do we empower the risk assurance leader, whether that is a compliance officer, an internal auditor, a chief risk officer, somebody else. How do we empower that person to make sure that if they are speaking truth to power and power doesn't like that message, they can still speak it? And ultimately, that depends on economic security, financial security. 2 years of severance is a very generous amount. It would give that executive 2 years of time to try and find a new job if necessary, possibly defend him or herself, and whatever sort of sacred honor might be called into question if a manager starts saying the CCO is lying or is the problem or goes into litigation. This gives the compliance officer a strong cushion. So all of this, all of these things I've talked about, really, they're true and they are going to work irrespective of the actual organization. I don't really know the chief compliance officer at the NRA. He seems like a very talented, competent person. I have no idea how long he's going to stay there. You know what? Doesn't matter. I don't even know who the president of the chief executive of the NRA is right now. Doesn't matter. Don't know who's in charge of the board. Doesn't matter. The NRA itself doesn't matter to the conversation we're having. What matters is that the group that is putting together an organization thinks about how do we have a strong system of checks and balances to make sure that no single center of power can pull the organization away from trying to achieve its mission. Everything is about how the whole organization works together to achieve its objectives. These recommendations, or not even recommendations, these requirements from the judge, they point to what that would look like. And like I said before, Tom, they are true irrespective of the particular organization here, what it stands for, what you think of its goals. Good governance is a universal principle and it rests on a few universal mechanisms. And that's that.
I think, first of all, that was a great summary, but also if you look, you can find some good examples that you can use in your corporate governance or your compliance program. And sometimes you can find outstanding examples. And I guess I feel like that's what you found by reviewing the court order in this matter.
That was pretty much it. Yeah. Look, compliance officers need good ideas and good examples wherever they can find them. Sometimes those examples come from strange places. I wasn't expecting that the NRA would be one, but these requirements from the judge, which the NRA is implementing, some of them it had already had been implementing, they are good stuff. And we should be thankful that we have this raw material out there. Compliance officers should take it and see what you can do with it in your own organization.
Matt, the next 2 Wednesdays are Christmas and New Year's, and we will not be posting on those days. You want to wish our audience happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and a safe New Year?
I do. Yes. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Have a good new year. And Tom, it's going to be 2 lonely weeks without our listeners, but we will be back in January and we can keep on going.